Hello guys, welcome back for another Apache Kafka video. In the previous video we managed to set up Kafka locally on Windows and run a basic example of a producer and a consumer, first using bat files and then using Python. Now we will see a few more in-depth practical examples. We are going to create multiple partitions, we are going to try multiple brokers with replication factor more than one, and we are going to see how to manually process only once and commit in Kafka Consumer using Python. Without further ado, let's jump into the code. We have 4 Python scripts right now, 2 producers and 2 consumers. This is the code for the producer, so we have a topic name named test, then we define the number of partitions, 1 in this case, and the replication factor is 1. So what we do here is check if this topic exists. First we list all the topics. If that topic doesn't exist, then we create it. And then we define a producer here with the value serializer and the key serializer. We don't pass any key right now. In the second example, we will do that. And here inside the for loop, we provide some data, right? The same thing we have here for the second consumer, exactly the same code. We don't do anything different. And in the consumer code, as you can see, we read data from this copy from this topic, and we set the auto offset reset to earliest, so we read all the messages from the beginning and then we display the message. The second consumer is exactly the same as the first one. Now what we have to do first is to, of course, start Zookeeper and the Kafka cluster. Open a command line and paste this command here. As you can see, we point to the Zookeeper server start.bat file, and we pass the Zookeeper properties file that we created in the previous video. So that's how you start Zookeeper. Let's start the Kafka cluster now after this one is up and running. Let's paste the second command to start the Kafka cluster. Here you can see we point to the kafka-server-start.bat file and we pass the server properties. Enter, and let's wait for the Kafka cluster to start. So here we are going to start the producers on the upper level, and then we are going to start the producers and type some data to see that we can use multiple producers pointing to the same topic and multiple consumers, again, reading from the same topic. So let's witness that. Let's run the Python scripts, and that would be producer 1. We don't have any topic yet. Now we create it. Provide a name, so let's say Mark Ostalos, right? And then let's start the second producer, producer number 2. Now we have already created the test because we run producer 1, and let's provide John. Let's provide another name, and here we can start using the consumer. We can start reading from the topic. Let's run this. Let's run the first consumer, and here you see the data, right? And we read the data from the beginning because that was what we defined in the Python code. Let's start the second consumer. Consumer number 2. As you can see, again, we read the same data from the beginning. So if we type a name here, let's say Paul, you will see the data in both consumers. So both consumers can read the same data, right? And if we type again in the second producer, so the second producer, we will see the data again in both consumers. But what happens, this is not very scalable, right? Because imagine that you have loads and loads of data and you have two consumers reading from the same partition. So what we have to do here, if we want to scale our application, we have to split the topic into partitions, and each consumer would read from a different partition. Now, before we do that, let's see if we go into the Kafka folder that we created in the previous video. If you check the logs, you will see here there's a folder with the name of the topic. So if you open that and you open this txt file, you will see all the data here, right? Mark and all the things, apostolos, and all the data that we sent. So for now, we only have one partition and both consumers read from the same partition. Now it's time to actually create multiple partitions. Back into the code. So what we have to do here, what we have to change in the script is define the number of partitions to 2 when we create a new topic. I have already deleted the previous topic, so we are going to recreate it using number of partitions 2. So here when we are going to create the topic, that would create 2 partitions for this topic. Exactly the same thing we have for producer number 2. And what changes on the consumer side is that we import from Kafka the topic partition. So here, when we create the Kafka consumer, we do not define the topic name here, but we assign the exact topic partition that we want to read. So we are going to assign to the consumer the topic partition which has this topic name and points to partition 0. And for consumer number 2, we are doing exactly the same thing, but we point to partition 1. What we expect to happen here is that when we run the producers and the consumers, consumer number 1 is going to read from partition 0, and consumer number 2 is going to read from partition 1. So although we are going to have two consumers, they are not going to read the same data. They are going to read from separate partitions, and this is how we can scale our application. Okay, so let's see what is going to happen now that we are going to start producer 1. So let's we recreate the topic. Let's provide a name. Let's provide my name, Apostolos, and then let's start producer number 2 and provide another name, let's say Mark. And here let's start consumer number 1 and see. As you can see, we didn't get any data into partition number 1, and that's why we don't display anything. But now that we are going to run consumer number 2, we expect to see the data. As you can see, yes, here we have read the data that we passed on the producers. If you go into our logs here, so if you go into Kafka folder, into the logs folder, you can see we have two new folders, one for the partition 0 and one for partition 1. So if you open test-0, the first partition, and if you open the txt file, you will see it is empty. Now, if you open the second file here under the test-1, in the second partition, if you open the data, you will see that we have the data here, Apostolos and Mark, right? And Mark here. But what happens if we want to send specific data into specific partitions? How can we do that? We can do that by defining a key, because right now we didn't define any key in the producers on the producer side, and that means Kafka is using round-robin fashion to distribute the messages to different partitions. But if we want to send specific data to specific partitions, then based on the key, Kafka is going to send the data with the same key into the same partition. How can we do that? So if we create let's say another topic, test2, right, in the producer. And here, when we send the data, if we pass the key, let's say the key would be the name. We have the key serializer here, right, to encode the key. And we have to do the same in the second producer and pass the key as well here. Key equals name, save that. And here let's change the topic name. And let's see what is going to happen now that we passed the key. We expect different names to go into different partitions, but then again, when we write the same name again, it has to go to the same partition as before. Let's witness that. Okay, so let's start the first producer, right? Producer number 1. Let's pass a name. Let's say Mark, and then John, and then let's start. Well, that was very wrongly typed, but let's start producer number 2, then pass my name, and then start consumer number 1 that reads from partition 1. And in partition 1 we have Mark and Apostolos, and in partition 2 we expect John, which is wrongly typed. So now what if we pass the same name? So let's pass Mark here in the first producer. We should expect, to see Mark only here in the first consumer, because it was sent to the same partition as before, partition number 1. And if we pass again here, if we pass Apostolos, it's going to go again to partition number 1. We see it only in consumer number 1. If we type John again, wrongly typed, of course, it's going to the same partition that it went before. We can verify that if we go into our logs here. You can see we have test2 partition 1 and test2 partition 2. So in partition 1, if we open the txt file, you will see the data. So we only have Mark, and then Apostolos, and then Mark again, and then Apostolos again, right? Because we passed the key as well, the name as the key. As you can see now, we have Mark as the key, and then we pass the data. Perfect. And the same thing we can witness in partition number 2. If you open the txt document, you will see John as the key and John with the data. And this is how you can specify the partition that you want to send specific data, and scale out your application however you want. So now let's see an example with multiple brokers. Go into your Kafka folder, in the config folder, and then here just copy that and paste it here, and paste it a couple of times. So let's say we are going to create 3 brokers, because that's the recommended amount of brokers that you need to have. Let's say one broker fails, then you have 2 backups, right? 2 other brokers. So let's say that the first one, let's rename it to server 1 and open that. So here we have the properties for server 1. So broker ID would be 0. Okay, that's plain text 992. That's fine. Now we have to point to logs 1. So we are going to create 2 more folders for the logs. And so each server, each broker would have its own folder, right, for the logs. Save that, and then go back to server number 2, rename that. Let's rename that, open that, and what we have to do is provide a different ID, of course. Let's say 1, and then here 93, and logs 2, right? Save that. So we have logs 1, logs 2, and then let's create the third one, the third broker. And here open that and provide a different ID that would be 2 here and 9094 and point to logs number 3, right? I think we have 2, yeah, number 3. So save that as well, and let's go back into our Kafka folder, and here let's rename that to 1. Copy that, paste it, and paste it twice, and here rename this into logs 2 and logs 3. So its broker now points to a different directory for its logs. Perfect. Back to our Python script, what we have to do here is actually define for Bootstrap servers, we have to pass 3 different brokers, the 3 different brokers that we created. So here in the Kafka admin client, in the Kafka admin producer as well, the same from producer number 2, and for the consumers as well, we pass this list of brokers. How are we going to start 3 different brokers? Again, first we have to spin up Zookeeper, and then we need to run each server in a different command line. So that would start 3 different brokers. It's very simple. Everything is up and running. All the brokers are running. Let's start with the first producer. It created the topic. Let's pass a name. Let's say Mark Apostolos. Let's start the second producer and pass another name, Paul and Catherine, let's say. And here let's start the consumers. We have consumer number 1 and it's reading all these names here. Catherine is here, Paul is here, everything is here actually. So let's start consumer number 2. Yeah, everything is here as well because we didn't specify a specific partition, so we read from all the partitions. Let's see our logs here. So in your Kafka folder, you have now 3 folders, one for each broker. So in broker 1, we have partition number 3. Let's see if we have any data here. Yeah, we have Mark and Apostolos, right? And Catherine. Okay, let's go into logs number 2. Broker number 2, we have the second partition. We can check if there is no data here in the second partition on the second broker. And let's check broker number 3, and we have the first partition. And I guess maybe we don't have any data here. What is going to happen if broker 1 breaks down? So let's do that. Let's see what is going to happen. Let me terminate broker 1, terminate the job. Yep, terminate the job, and here now broker 1 is down. Let's type another name in the producer, Mark 2, right? But as you can see, nothing went to the consumers because broker 1 is down, right? We still have broker 2 and 3, but there are no replicas because the replication factor is 1. So as you can see, Kafka is still working, but we do not get the data because everything goes to broker 1 and broker 1 is down, so we don't have any replicas. Now what we have to do is actually set the replication factor to 3. So each message has a replica in a different broker, and if one broker is down, then we get the data from the other broker. Back in our code, so here in the replication factor, let's set that into 3. We have 3 different brokers. Let's set replication factor to 3. That makes sense. Let's change the topic name to test2. Let's do the same one for producer number 2, and here test2, right? In the consumers, the same thing here. And let's go back into our and run the producers and the consumers again, now that we have the replication factor equals to 3. Okay, so let's start producer number 1. Let's provide a name, mix. And then here, let's provide start producer number 2 and provide another name, Costolos, right? And John, and here, Mark. And let's start the consumers as well. We should see all the names because we read from all the partitions and all the brokers, right? If we go into our logs file, you will see now under logs 1 we have a different topic, test 2, that has 3 partitions, and here some of them have data, some are not, depending on the partition, and this one hasn't, but this one has, right? So in partition 2 we can see the data. Now remember, we set the replication factor to 3, so if we go into the second broker, again to the second partition, you will see the replicas here, right? And the same for broker number 3, partition number 2. Let's say one broker is down, so broker 1 is down, right? So I terminated broker 1. Still though, if we type a name here, like test, you are going to see the data into the consumer, because if one broker is down, then we have replicas from the other brokers, and then another broker is the leader, and we consume the data from the leader. So as you can see, it's pretty cool that we have replicas, we don't have any data loss, and we can still, Kafka is still working, and we have that's why we have multiple brokers and multiple replicas. In case of one broker going down, then we have the replicas from the other brokers. Moving on to our last example, we have this acknowledgement parameter that we can pass, where it says, so the number of acknowledgements the producer requires the leader to have received before considering a request complete. So if we set it to 0, then it's like fire and forget. The producer sends the message to the Kafka broker, but it doesn't require any acknowledgement back. If we set it to 1, which is the default, it's going to wait for the leader only to write the record to its local log only, as you can see. But if we want to make sure that the broker received what the producer sent, then we have to set it to all. So we have to wait for the leader to get acknowledgements for the replicas, for the other brokers, that we have the replicas that this message was received, and it's going to send it back to the producer. So we want to make sure we are not going to lose any data or send duplicates. How can we do that in the data? So here, when we of course, first we need to set the replication factor to something more than 1, because we need essentially for the replicas to reply that they received this message from the producer. So we need replication factor more than 1. And here, when we create the Kafka producer, you can see we pass this parameter ax to all, right? The next thing we have to do is actually make sure that on the consumer side, we process the data only once. How can we achieve that? We can achieve that by disabling the auto commit. So as you can see here, enable auto commit is false, and we have to define a group ID in order to commit manually. So we are going to commit manually, and in order to do that, we have to specify the topic partition for each message that we receive from the broker, and then create an offset and metadata object that we can import from the Kafka library. Here, as you can see, we create a dictionary with the topic as the key, and the offset and metadata object as the value. And here we commit manually. So why the offset +1? Because now the broker knows that we have processed up to the offset, to the current offset. So the next message will be from offset +1. So let's run this code. Let's run producer number 1, and let's run consumer number 3 for this example. So let's provide a name, Mark, and here, as you can see, we have the topic partition, which is test, and partition number 2, and the offset is 1. Then let's type apostles, and offset is 2 now, the same partition, etc., etc. And this is how we can commit manually. So we have in the producer, on the producer side, we have set acknowledgement to all. So we wait for all the in-sync replicas to return, to verify to the producer that they received the message. And then on the consumer side, we only want to process once, and that would be using manual commit. This is it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video and you found these examples easy and practical to follow. I'm going to upload the code on GitHub in case you need it. Please click the like button, leave a message, and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the new one. Thank you.